one you're here for, so I'll let him go ahead and get started.
Well, thank you, Leah. Appreciate you. She's wonderful. Appreciate this lovely museum. This is a delight for me to be able to come and share a few things from my collection. My book's called Show and Tell. That's kind of the way my life is. So, so we do show and tell. I never outgrew kindergarten. I love show and tell. So, even though I went to law school. Well, we've got one of my favorite subjects today is Brigham Young. And he was a great leader. I think that without Brigham Young, I'm not sure the Latter-day Saints would have made it across the plains and out here. But he was a very strong leader. I personally feel like he was raised by the Lord to do what he did. And his people felt that he was a prophet, and as I do. Anyway, Brigham Young was born on June 1st of 1801, so he was 4.5 years older than Joseph Smith, whom he replaced as president of the church after the prophet and Hiram had been martyred on June 27th of 1844. Brigham was born in Whittingham, Vermont, the eighth child of 10, well actually 11 because he had 10 siblings. Anyway, he was a child of John and Abigail Nabby Howe Young. His family moved to upstate New York when he was 3 years old, and his mother died when he was 14. At 16, his father booted him out of the house, basically. So at 16, he had to provide for himself. I think that says a lot about Brigham Young and how he got a very early start as a carpenter and glazier and so on, learned the trades. He worked odd jobs, apprenticing with several individuals as a carpenter, painter, and glazier. Among the homes he painted in his youth was the future residence of William H. Seward, who you may recall was Lincoln's Secretary of State. That home still stands. Anyway, Seward later purchased Alaska, remember, from Russia. They called it Seward's Icebox in 1867. Brigham Young was converted to the Reformed Methodist Church in 1824. But he didn't like the fact that they wanted to sprinkle him, not to baptize him, because he had read in his Bible that it was baptism by immersion. So he had some differences with them right at the beginning. His young marriage was to Miriam Works in 1824. She died quite young. And they lived at Port Byron, New York, in a small house that was adjacent to a pail factory where he worked at the time. In 1828, he moved to Mendon, New York, where most of his brothers had moved their families. There's a wonderful picture I didn't bring with him and his brothers, but I think most of you have probably seen it. But anyway, he had a lot of brothers. It was there at Mendon, New York, where he met his great friend, Heber C. Kimball, who would become his lifelong friend and pal and counselor. When his wife Miriam died in 1832, they'd just been married 8 years, he and his two daughters were welcomed into the Kimball home to live with Heber and his wife Valette. If any of you come to my little store downtown, you'll see the wool weasel that his wife Valette used for twisting wool. It's too big to haul here, so I didn't tonight. But if you come to my little place, downtown Provo 65 North University Avenue, I'm down the basement. You can see the Valette's wool weasel, and there's also a spinning wheel. You'd put things on a spinning wheel later. Brigham had, and I'm reading something that I wrote this time. Brigham Young had converted to the LDS Church after reading the Book of Mormon, was baptized along with his friend Heber C. Kimball by Eliezer Miller and Alpheus Gifford. And I need to stop there because Eliezer and Alpheus went out in a fivesome of missionaries about the same time as Samuel Smith became our first official LDS missionary, those of you that are LDS. And that was 1831. So at any rate, Alpheus and Eliezer, they eventually ended up in twosomes. And they went up to the Mendon area in New York. They traveled around this area, and they met some men that were in the Reformed Methodist Conference, among whom were Brigham Young and his buddy Heber C. Kimball. And Eliezer Miller you've never heard of, Alpheus Gifford you've never heard of, because if you can't write, you're forgotten. I hate to say it, but it turned out their one missionary baptism apiece turned out pretty good. Eliezer baptized Brigham Young, and Alpheus Gifford, who's my great-great-grandpa, baptized Heber C. Kimball. So we didn't know if Alpheus ever made it to Utah, and my wife and I finally found out when the church took over the Nauvoo Cemetery years ago that he was buried there at Nauvoo. So he never made it out. But any rate, it was my great-great-grandfather speaking in tongues that got Brigham pretty excited about the church, and he asked Joseph Smith, when he first met him, if he could also speak in tongues. And it was told to him that they were speaking what Joseph called the Adamic language, which I've never heard, but it sounds interesting, and must have been an interesting experience for both of them. Well, in 1833, Brigham moved to Kirtland, where he met Mary Ann Angel, and they were married in 1834. As a member of Zion's camp, he traveled with the prophet to Missouri in 1834. He then worked as a carpenter in the Kirtland Temple. He also studied Hebrew there with the prophet and others under Joshua Sexius. I should mention that his carpentry work was very good. He worked on both the Kirtland Temple and later the Nauvoo Temple, and he was a hard worker, as you can imagine. His church leadership began when he also said that he thought the Zion's camp was successful. Now, a lot of people wouldn't say that, but a lot of the members that went on Zion's camp felt that it was a very successful thing. It was a very trying thing, and I think that their leadership came to the forefront, those that were leaders later. And the Quorum of the 12 Apostles of the LDS Church was organized in May 1835, the next year, and Brigham Young eventually became the president of that quorum soon after. Any rate, later in Missouri, it was Brigham Young as president of the 12 who directed the exodus from Missouri to Illinois. And sometimes he's not given much credit for that, but the church leadership was at Liberty Jail, some name for a jail, at the time. And Joseph was ordered to be taken out and shot, but we all know the story of how, Donovan stood in the way of that illegal order, and that didn't happen. But Joseph and his brother and many of the top leaders of the church, Sidney and the others, were in jail during that period. So Brigham Young, as then president of 12, organized the exodus when the exterminating order was issued by Governor Boggs, and they were forced to leave. Now we brought a Boggs document last time. At any rate, he's not on our favorite top 10 lists of Latter-day Saint people. I was telling some nasty things about him years ago that I think were all true, but not too friendly. When I was conducting a tour over the 4th of July, we did it for 20 years at Luke Crandall's printing museum. I was actually chairman of his board for a while. And I was telling him, I showed the Boggs document out here the last time, and I said, this is the guy that issued the exterminating order against the Latter-day Saints. It wasn't lifted until the bicentennial in 1976 by the then governor of Missouri. And I've got a copy of that signed by him too. But anyway, he was kind of a bad guy. Anyway, I found out I was talking to Boggs's descendants. And, so it was rather embarrassing, and I found out that they'd actually joined the LDS Church. So I had to repent a little bit about what I said about Boggs, because his family, as bad as he may have been, did a turnaround towards the Latter-day Saints later on. Anyway, Brigham organized that, and that was it's interesting, in my opinion, how the Lord prepares people to go do bigger things later. Were very similar. He had to organize the saints when they made their big trek, as we know, from across the plains from Nauvoo to the valley of the Great Salt Lake. 7 years later. Well, just briefly, as we know, Brigham Young became the great American colonizer, helping found more than 350 towns throughout the American West. He passed away in 1877. This is the largest known tin type of Brigham Young. It's made, on tin. And there are only 6 known tin types that we found on Brigham. 3 of them happen to be in our collection. The church has one, and there's 2 others in private hands. Those are the only ones that have turned up, but the other 5 are little CDVs, small tin types. This is the largest one known. When I got it originally years ago, it had another tin type of the same size as George A. Smith, and that one I gave to the church some time back. I like to hang on to a few things. We've donated a lot of stuff to the church over the years. In fact, I served 2 missions up there at the old church archives, which was in the east side of the church administration building, church headquarters building. And then, of course, the church history library, which was being built during that time. I served there for a number of years, and I'm not sure, they released me, I guess, but I'm still hauling stuff up. My missions were to haul my stuff up. So I used to joke with Marlon Jensen, the church historian, about that, and I joked about it because I got these U-Haul book boxes. Those of you that ever used those, they're supposed to be perfect size. I'm having a hard time moving them around now. I've got thousands of them full of books. I'm always kind of cussing under my breath at the young guy that put all these in my storage units years ago. But I don't know what to do about it. I don't think I'm going to outlive getting rid of them. But I was taking up 10 boxes to the church on Mondays and returning about 5 or 6 boxes. They would return to them after they went through on Fridays. And I was getting a little discouraged because I thought, well, they're not taking much. And I guess my discouragement got back to Elder Jensen because he hauled me in and says, well, what's this I hear about your one? I says, well, it seems like I'm just a moving company, moving books back and forth. I work all week to try to find them for you, and then I haul them up, and you don't take very many of them. He said, well, what we're taking really fills in some gaps in church history. That's all he needed to say. And I was fine with it from then on. So we took up about 140,000 items. And during those I think there were about 10 or 12 years we were serving there in a couple of missions. It turned out to be a very positive thing, and I'm still hauling stuff up there all the time. So we took some stuff up there and picked some stuff up last week. So still carried on, although I'm not an official missionary anymore. Every member a missionary, right? Any rate, also from our collection is a letter he signed to his son, Brigham Morris Young, who was struggling with the native language while serving a mission to the Sandwich Islands, Hawaii in 1874. Brigham's life is so vast that I can't cover it, do it real respect without doing a 10-volume series. So I'm going to just try to hit some overviews based on my artifacts. That was kind of the idea of this anyway. And that letter happens to be my favorite one. And let's see, where'd I put it here? Any rate, it's right here. Okay. This letter, I don't know, when my mother was dying of cancer many years ago, back in '77, my friend Dean Jesse, some of you may know Dean, was one of our great historians. He's in his 90s now, lives in Salt Lake, he's retired. I got to visit him a year or so ago. Good friend. Anyway, he wrote a book called Brigham Young's Letters to His Sons. And I don't know if you remember that. That book came out in 1977, the same year my mother died. And my dad just happened to give that to me as a little token of appreciation when we had helped take care of my mother during her last months. And I went through the book and I highlighted one letter that I thought was my favorite of all these letters to the sons. Lo and behold, years later, I got the original. And I didn't know that till I went back through the book and saw that I'd only marked this one letter. Now, maybe there are coincidences in life, but I felt like this was kind of an important one. Maybe I can share this letter. We're out of order here, but I can share it with you. The text is wonderful. Brigham's letter. Brigham had 4 sons named Brigham out of his 50 some odd children. The latest count is about 56 wives and about the same number of kids. The wives have gone up in recent years. Many of those were just in name only, where he would, support various women that needed to have a husband to support. But those were the ones, he supported many others too, but those were the ones that were legally bound to him by marriage. He had children by 16 of his wives, amounting to about the same number, 56 or so children. And 46 of the children survived till adulthood. So, and many of his wives outlived him, quite a bunch of them. One of the photos I gave the church recently was a photo taken in 1899 of Brigham's surviving wives, and I think there were about 10 in the picture of the wives. So even as late as that period of time, some of them were still, and they were all very proud to be called his wife. Well, he had received from, because he had 4 kids named Brigham, they went by their middle names to him. So Brigham Morris Young is the one this letter that I marked in the book years ago was written to, and he's responding to Morris, who was serving in the Sandwich Islands. You all know where that is, right? It's Hawaii. And my good friend Mel Larson lived there for years, so he's here tonight. Beautiful spot. We just happened to be in Lahaina a few months before the big fire last year, so I can't imagine the destruction there and how sad, but I hope they can rebuild. Anyway, this is a letter that Brigham was responding to Morris Young, who was having a hard time learning the native language. That's not too unique, is it, for a missionary? No MTCs back then, so he had to learn it, on the spot, and it was difficult. And Brigham makes reference to that here. Brigham had so many letters to sign that if you get up to the church museum, you'll see the 4-sided desk he developed to keep different clerks going on different letters as he got different ideas. He'd say he was governor of Utah, he was president of the church, he was the head of Indian affairs for Utah. He had all these jobs at the same time and other responsibilities of a huge family. And so he would keep the clerks busy writing parts of his letters. He'd stop on one and he'd say, oh yeah, well, let's go back to that letter, and and these clerks would write these letters for him. Well, this was to the son, Morris, and he'd gotten 2 letters from him in 1874, and he said, your kind letters of June 11th and August 6th were received about a month from date, and it is with much pleasure that I learn of your success in instructing the natives in the principles of the gospel. Your difficulty in learning the language will disappear, I hope, by the study which I know full well you will give it. Never allow your courage to fail you. Man's greatest works have been done by men of patience, perseverance, and a determined will, which would acknowledge no defeat, rather than by those gifted with a natural ability which made success easy, but who lacked the tenaciousness of purpose. Then, my boy, never say fail, but work on in the way you have started, and your reward is certain. Isn't that great advice for all of us? You bet. And you can't miss this. The letter's written out by a clerk, but you can't miss his big signature. You can probably see it on the back row there. That's my favorite letter, and I got that years after I'd marked it in Dean Jesse's book, Letters to His Sons. There are other letters, though, that are of interest, and one of the ones I want to share with you today is this one. As far as history goes, this is probably the most historic letter I've ever had or ever planned to have. When Leonard Arrington was working on his book on Brigham Young, which is still kind of a standard on it, I got to help him just a little bit because I had this letter. Among other things, this was the only letter they've ever found written by Brigham on the Vanguard trip to Utah. In other words, from the time they left Council Bluffs with 150 odd people till they hit the Great Salt Lake Valley, he wrote this one letter. We don't know of any others. He started it on April 20th of 47 and finished it on May 2nd. So he didn't have a lot of time to write letters. But let me just share a little of this with you. The other nice thing about it is, unlike that other letter was written by a clerk, this is entirely written by Brigham. And there are very few letters are entirely written by Brigham Young, because he used clerks like Joseph Smith did earlier to write all his letters. And his letters that are handwritten are almost as rare as the prophet Joseph's, even though he was president of the church for 29 years and wrote a lot more letters. They were mostly dictated and then signed. This is at 9 o'clock p.m., Pioneer Camp of Israel, and he's a phonetic speller. You know what that means? That means if it sounds right, it's spelled right, and I think that ought to still be the rule. Because that's what I follow in a lot of my correspondence, even though I try to correct the spelling sometimes. But Pioneer Camp of Israel is Israel, Israel, 95 miles from winter quarters. It's April 20th, 1847, 9 o'clock p.m. My dear companion, this is written back to Mary Ann Angel Young at the winter quarters, and he didn't have envelopes then, so he just folded the thing up and put her address here, okay? And it just says winter quarters, Mary A. Young. Anyway, my dear companion, partner in tribulation, I should have written you by Brother Rockwood, but had not time. The camp was to be organized and a great, G-R-A-T-E, deal to be done to prepare for moving, M-O-O-V-I-N-G. Now, I won't spell them all, but you'll get the idea here, okay? On Sunday, I should have written, but did not feel able to. I laid, L-A-D-E, abed, and thought of a great deal I should like to say to you. The camp is in good health and first-rate spirits. They have never felt better in their lives. I think my health has been very much improved yesterday and today. You mentioned, M-E-N-S-H-E-N-D, you mentioned in your letter that you heard, H-E-R-D, I lay on the ground the night I left home. I did, but do not think it hurt me. But when I arrived in camp, I found myself completely tired out. I thank you 1,000 times for your kind letters to me, especially for your kind acts, and still more for your kind heart, H-A-R-T. I pray for you and the children continually and for all of our family. I do think the Lord has blessed me with one of the best families that any man ever had on earth. I do hope the children will be good and mind their mother when I'm gone. My son Joseph, you must not go away from home, and Brigham also must stay at home. How do you suppose, I won't try to spell all these, how do you suppose I would feel when I come home and find one of my children destroyed by Indians, I-N-D-E-N-S? I pray this may not be the case. You mentioned there is a great deal of cold for money there. I do not want you to pay any of my debts till I come back. At any rate, I made arrangements with Brother Whitney to pay all that I wish paid. Do make yourself comfortable and let the other folks do so too. Well, that's what he wrote on April 20th. He didn't finish the letter till May 4th. I won't read you that part except to say that he says, I think from now on we'll travel on the north side of the Platte River. He says, all of our enemies are heading west on the south side of the Platte River, and from Missouri and Illinois and so on. He says, I think we'll take our chances with the Lamanites, which was a decision they followed on every trek thereafter, and some of the saints may wonder why, but it was that first trek that determined that. Now, if some of you remember this letter, it was in the Relief Society and Priesthood Manual years ago when they did Brigham Young. It just said owned by a private collector. That's all that they'll put in. I had one in the Joseph Smith one too, but that's just what they put in. Now, my only complaint with that is that when I'm gone a few years, will anybody know where this stuff is? Future generation. So it's not an ego trip. I don't care if my name's in there, other than just I think somebody needs to record where things are, and hopefully they're doing that. But at any rate, you get a little flavor for this great pioneer leader. And he didn't have a lot of time to, as I say, to write letters and things, but he did take the time to write his wife when he could. Now they get to Utah, and they got to start everything all over again. Can you imagine? They didn't have a monetary system. I had another great-great-grandfather who was a convert that he was a member of the Mormon Battalion, and his name was Marcus D. Lafayette Shepherd. And my little brother named Mark Shepard Ashworth is named after him. At any rate, he was a great-great-grandfather also, and he eventually made it to Beaver, Utah, but is buried down there where the Ashworths were sent to colonize. But he went with the Mormon Battalion, marched, and ended up at Sutter's Fort when gold was discovered. So he was one of the boys that was there. He wasn't one of the four that discovered gold, but he got to search for a little of it there while he was working with Sutter building his mill. And then he headed to Utah after that. Well, he brought with him, like many of them did from the gold rush, gold dust. And this came at an opportune time in 1849, mostly, when some of them came through, because they'd already tried to do a few things to get a monetary system going. The first thing they did is fulfill a prophecy of Joseph Smith. He told the saints, half the leaders who left over the Kirtland Safety Society, to hang on to the Kirtland Safety notes, because he says someday they'd be as good as gold. That's what the prophet said. Well, that's literally what happened, because out here in Utah, Brigham had a roll of about 158 of these notes, and he reissued them out here in Utah. This is one of the reissued $1 bills. A little hard to see, but if you want to come up later, you can see it closer. But he reissued it by signing above Heber C. Kimball's signature, who signed right across Sidney Rigdon's signature. Okay? And this has the prophet's signature on it, Joseph Smith. It's one of the few things you get both Joseph and Brigham on the same page. I've had a few others over the years that I've mostly donated to the church and BYU, but this is kind of a unique thing. So they issued these, and they lasted for a few days to use as a medium of exchange. And then they cut some, when the first press got here in '49, they cut some little white notes. I didn't bring those today. I do have a set of those too, or gold notes as they called, but again, they were traded for gold dust that was coming from the Mormon Battalion boys coming back from working for Mr. Sutter. He allowed them to go out and find gold dust and so on. So they brought that back. Ultimately, they set up a mint on right next to Temple Square, where the Hotel Utah Joseph Smith Memorial Building is now. And I've got some old photos of the mint. And they minted coins. Mormon coins were not highly valued at that time because, like the $5 gold piece, which is the more common one, I have an original one of those. The others are so rare I've never had them, other than I had a 2.5 once, and I had a later 5 that was done in 1860. But I had one of the 49ers I've kept, and they're underweighed. Okay, at the time they didn't have $5 worth of gold in them; they had like $4 and something. So the non-Mormons refused to take Mormon gold because, I don't think the Latter-day Saints were cheating or Brigham was cheating. I just think they couldn't weigh it very well. They didn't have good scales, and so there are different measures as you measure the few coins that survive. Consequently, many of the Mormon gold coins were melted down during Brigham's time. I've got one letter here that, let me find it here quick. Here it is. This is it. I've got a letter here, Brigham, written to a J. William Anderson from Great Salt Lake City, July 7, 1862. This guy lived in Orange County, New York. At any rate, he says, "Sir, in reply to your favor of March 29th, I have to inform you that in our early day of our settlement here, when coin was scarce and California gold dust tolerably plenty, but unhandy in that shape, for convenience sake, dies for 20, 10, 5, and $2.50 gold pieces were made, and the gold dust in the market was coined. Small amounts have been coined since the aforesaid date." They did a few in $5 ones in 1860. "At times when gold dust has accumulated here sufficient to make it pay to do so, but such amounts are scarcely worth mentioning since the government began coining in California. There are 2 dies for the $5 piece, the one made recently being quite different from the other one. At any rate, should you wish specimens of the coins made here, they will be remitted in the market upon receipt. They're already scarce. Upon receipt of your selection, accompanied by the corresponding amount, either in gold or government currency, by mail at your risk, unless you prefer waiting an opportunity for their being forwarded by hands of source of some trusty person going from here to your region of the country. Respectfully, Brigham Young. Anyway, he makes mention of the gold coins. By 1862, they were kind of scarce, as he said, but we can tolerably look for some if you want us to find a few. A couple other things that are kind of interesting here. The earliest signature I've got of Brigham Young is in 1843, when the prophet Joseph was still alive. He went and visited the brand new Battle of Bunker Hill Monument. Have any of you been to the Bunker Hill Monument? Yeah, went there. We were in the Boston mission, our last mission, so we got to go to the bunker. But I'd been there once before as a kid with my family. But at any rate, Brigham bought this book there. The nice thing about it is he made a big long inscription in the front of the book, and he said September 26, 1843, Brigham Young's, and he's underlined that or put his little mark under it. Book, Brigham Young's book. I went to the top of the monument in company with elders, and he's listed several elders and Sister Wingate. Went through the sand yard and the rope walk. He said, I bought this book of a one-armed man. So that's why he recorded his purchase of this book at the Battle of Bunker Hill. And a couple of other things that are of interest here I want to point out. Brigham Young was appointed governor by Millard Fillmore. And Millard Fillmore's not a real famous president now, but he was a big name in Utah. And you know that Brigham, when he received the commission from President Fillmore, he immediately created a county, Millard County, and Fillmore was the capital. And that was where the territorial capital was under construction. They only got one wing of it done. Have all of you been through the territorial capital? It's fun place to go. They only got the one wing done, but it served there for a couple of years before they had to move it back to where all the population was in Salt Lake. It was the center. It was picked out because it was the center spot in Utah, but unfortunately, wasn't a lot to do in Fillmore. Glad things have improved a lot since, but still, Fillmore's a relatively small town. Fillmore later recorded that the reason he had picked Brigham Young to be governor was because he read an address that one Thomas L. Kane had made before the Historical Society of Pennsylvania in 1850, the same year he appointed Brigham Young as governor. And our collection's rather fortunate. I don't know that I've shown this very often, but this is the little pamphlet the president was reading, The Mormons by Thomas L. Kane. The fun thing about this is it was President Millard Fillmore's copy, and he signed it. So we've got a little piece of LDS history here, kind of, because Fillmore read this, and he said it was because he read this that he decided to appoint Brigham Young as territorial governor. And Brigham was governor until Utah war times. We remember a little about that. And of course, the horrible Mountain Meadows massacre during that time as well. I should mention a few things here that happened in Utah a little earlier in the 1850s. First of all, this is the original draft memorial to Congress from the territory of Utah asking for an appropriation to cover the cost of the provisional government of the state of Deseret. So this was the draft that they kept here. It was later, and it was signed by Willard Richards as president of the council, W.W. Phelps as Speaker of the House, and Brigham Young as governor. March 3rd, 1852. One of the very first acts they did was to legalize the state of Deseret, and what they'd been doing here for a couple of years but wasn't recognized by the federal government, even though they tried to get them to do it. And then there's another memorial to Congress here. This one is kind of interesting because it asked for an appropriation from the Congress to pay the code commissioners who were writing the first Utah code. Now, as an attorney, this kind of impressed me a lot that they were trying to pay for the original Utah code, because the original Utah code was quite small, and it's a bit larger now, quite a bit. I was in California. My little brother's, like I say, Mark Ashworth, is also an attorney, and he was showing me this big wall before they got on the internet of all of the books of the California code. So no wonder they're so mixed up down there. Utah code was one shelf when I was in law school. So, but that was 50 years ago. So it's gotten bigger. And then finally, this one is the original memorial to Congress to build a telegraph in 1852, signed by the leadership again. These were all printed in the first little book they put out of the memorials and so on to Congress. They were way ahead of their time. Next time we're going to talk a little about the Pony Express, which got put out of business by the telegraph. When it finally was put out there in 1861 at the beginning of the Civil War. There's also a really rare little pamphlet. We only printed 100 of these. This is the first annual message of the governor to the Legislative Assembly of the Territory of Utah, September 22nd, 1851. That's when they first made Utah a territory. And this is kind of a fun piece. This is they were asked as a territory to submit a design and a block to be used on the inside of the Washington Monument, which is the big national public monument to President Washington that was going up at the time. Many of you know that they quit working on this at different times. They finally got the thing done. But this is what the block looked like. There's actually two blocks. This is the Deseret Stone here. There's one from Utah Territory too. So if any of you walk up the 800 and some odd steps of the Washington Monument, I got to do it as a kid. I don't know if they let you do it anymore. There's an elevator that goes up. But I saw both of the Deseret Stone and the Utah Stone there. And this is the original resolution signed resolved by the Governor and Legislative Assembly of the Territory of Utah. They hereby authorize and requested to forward to the Washington Monument Committee this marble block, and then later another one. And this is signed by Benjamin Ferris, who was at the time secretary, non-Mormon secretary in Utah Territory. Also brought one of his mission calls. I've got several of these, but this one was kind of fun because it was later on. It's 1876, year before he died, and his presidency at the time included his son, John W. Young, who later didn't stay faithful to the church, but was his first counselor for a while, and Daniel H. Wells as the first presidency. And this is the mission call for Orson F. Whitney. So if you remember Orson Whitney, that was his second mission call. And there's also a little document here from the PEF. Remember the Perpetual Immigration Fund that was started by Brigham Young in order to pay for people to come over to, we were in the midst of gathering, the saints to Zion at the time. And here this brother writes a letter to him and says, "Brother Young, I have a sister staying with Mr. Fulkerson, Lexington, Missouri. Her husband is dead, and she's very desirous of coming on to the valley. I am on hand to help pay her passage. I would like her to come next season." And so Brigham probably paid the rest for her to come of the PEF. And finally, since we're talking a little bit about the pioneers as well as Brigham Young, this is one of my favorite pioneer pieces. I don't know if you can see this very well, but this is a box that Rutger Clausen, who was president of 12 for 21 years, was given by his mother, okay, in 1899. They came to Utah in a wagon, which she had the wagon box that came to Utah, and she made one of these for each of her children. So it's carved with a wagon on the front of it. It's kind of a precious thing. And on the inside, this cabinet was made from the wagon box in which Thomas Alfred Judd and his wife, Teresa Hastings, at any rate, it was his grandparents came to Utah. And he was given that box, and so his name was engraved on here. The interesting part of that was Rutger Clausen was the first Mormon that was convicted after Reynolds versus the United States. George Reynolds was clerk to Brigham Young and was the test case for polygamy. And he was sent up to the Wyoming Territorial Prison at Laramie. I did a book on Butch Cassidy years ago, and Larry Pointer, the author, and me got to sell copies of it up there because that's where Butch spent the only stretch he spent in jail for rustling some horses in Laramie. Well, that's also where the first polygamist, George Reynolds, who was assigned by Brigham to take the fall in the case, ended up in jail. And George Reynolds later converted and baptized his jailers, which is kind of an interesting story in our history. But after that, Rutger Clausen became the first man convicted under the Edmunds law, which was in 1882, and he was given 5-year sentence. We could do a whole thing on him. He's an interesting guy. And this little box that his mother had given him as a kid, that their family came to Utah in originally in 1849, was jammed with his prison photo of his striped outfit he was on at the Utah Pen, and the seal of the Territory of Utah. Incidentally, when he was convicted, he was given a 5-year sentence. Nobody was given that long. And he served over 4 years of that sentence. So he was in there longer than anyone. I had great-grandfathers there. I don't know how many of you might have had relatives there. But my wife had one in the Yuma Territorial Prison down in Arizona. And that was a horrible place. We went and visited that. It's so hot and run down. But that was for polygamy also in Arizona Territory. But it's amazing what he put up with. And when he was convicted, he made a famous speech, Rutger did, that when the laws of God and the laws of the country go haywire with each other, he's going to follow the laws of his conscience and God. So he was given 5 years prison, and long time. He served over 4 of it. And his first wife left him when he was convicted, so he only had one wife when he went to prison for those 4 years. That's Rutger Clausen, later a general authority. Anyway, we go into his history. That's too much, but it started with Brigham Young pursuing what had been begun by the prophet in the revelation on plural marriage, which has been totally thrown out the window now by the church, of course, by the manifesto in 1890 and so on. Anyway, that touches on Brigham's life. Mountain Meadows, that I won't get into, touches. We had family involved with that. Touches on Brigham's life, as you know. And the Utah War. I did bring a few other things from that. The Utah War, Brigham Young said if we had 10 years in these valleys, they'll never get us out of here because we've been chased, from place to place. Almost exactly 10 years after they arrived, in fact, it was exactly, Friday the 24th of July, 1857, this little invitation went out to the saints to gather up in Cottonwood Canyon. And it says, picnic party at the headwaters of Big Cottonwood. President Brigham Young respectfully invites, in this case, David Fulmer, who was stake president in Salt Lake, and family to attend picnic party at the lake in Big Cottonwood Canyon, Kanyon, on Friday, 24th July. And it had regulations. You had to get there on time or you wouldn't get any food or anything. It was this party that, as you know, Porter Rockwell and the others came into and said, hey, there's an army on the way to Utah. And that's where they got notified. He got exactly his 10 years. He says, if they got 10 years here, they'll never get us out of here. He issued this proclamation. This is quite a rare thing. Meldon, you were asking me about this, and this is the original I have. There were 2 printings. This is the first one in August of 1857. And it's quite famous now, but this is actually an original. It says, citizens of Utah, proclamation by the governor, we are invaded by a hostile force who are evidently assailing us to accomplish our overthrow and destruction. So it starts out. So you get the idea that they meant business, And Brigham sent Eve Hanks and the others up to Porter Rockwell and others to delay the army, which they did during the entire winter and delayed them in coming through. Well, I probably spent more time here than I should, but the head of the Army coming into Utah was Albert Sidney Johnston. This is a letter of him written from Utah. It's kind of rare. It's just sending supplies or whatever back. Headquarters Department of Utah, Camp Floyd, Utah Territory. Now, you all know that Camp Floyd is named after the Secretary of War, who became a redcoat and went with the South, as did Johnson. And so Camp Floyd's name was changed to Fort Crittenden. It was because he wanted to name it after Johnny Reb. So we changed the name of the fort when he left. And there's a couple other things that are kind of interesting here. I won't have time to go through them, but this is a fun little book too. The problem with Brigham is there's just too much stuff, so maybe I shouldn't have picked this out. But this neat topic. Incidentally, the chair was made by Brigham. He was a carpenter. And this you'll see in my shop. Those people have been there have already seen it. This was made for his wife, Emily Dow Partridge Young. And he supposedly made one chair. It's called the gondola. It's a Pioneer gondola design. He supposedly made a chair. I don't know if they were all the same design or different, but he was a very good carpenter. And he made this for Emily Dow Partridge Young. He made a chair supposedly for each wife, the story goes. And he measured each wife so they got their own chair. And the question I sometimes get is, well, what happened if the wife outgrew the chair? Well, I guess they played musical chairs. I don't know what they did. But some of the wives saved the chairs, and this is one that got saved that will be back in my store. And then finally, I just wanted to show you the only book that I'm aware of that came out on Brigham Young's life among Utah was this one. This is the life of Brigham Young, or Utah and his founders, written by Edward Toolidge, who was kind of on the fringe of belief. But this was the book that came out on Brigham's life while he was still alive. I've had several copies of it. I had Brigham's personal copy of it, which I gave to Mark Hoffman, which was signed 6 times by Brigham. He signed his books sometimes, when they were his personal books, on every 100 pages. So you know you got one of Brigham's personal copies if you're on page 100, 200, 300, 400, whatever it is. Brigham signed his name on the top of that page, because I don't know if he was afraid somebody's going to take the first 99 pages out. But that's how he showed his ownership, okay, in his books. This is one he presented, so it's not signed that way, but this one is presented to Lorenzo Snow by Brigham Young, Salt Lake City, Utah Territory, October 16, 1876. I've got one still that belonged to one of his wives, Emmeline Free Young, who had most of his kids, 10 of his kids she had. I've got a letter that he wrote her. It's a handwritten letter, and he says, this is the 5th. He'd run out of town because they were chasing him on some legal things at that time, polygamy. And he left town, and he was down in St. George at his winter home. And he wrote a letter to Emmeline, which I have, which says, this is almost the first letter I've ever written you. This is my 5th letter today. But he used the same phonetic spelling throughout. If you need medicines, spelled the same way, go to Brother So-and-so and you can get them. Well, I'll just kind of end it on this. We could go on forever about Brigham Young. He's one of my favorite people to collect and to discuss and to learn about. But never allow your courage to fail you. I think that's great advice. Brigham had a rough growing up period. I didn't really talk about his youth, but he said all he remembered about his dad before his mother died when he was 14. And at 16, his dad kicked him out of the house. And all he'd say of his father is that, quote, it used to be a word and a blow with him, but the blow came first. So he had a rough bringing up. He also was very determined to allow his kids to learn music and other things, dance, and do things that he was not allowed to do as a youth. And I think that's one of the reasons why we got the first theater west of the Mississippi in Salt Lake, and many other things. Brigham Young enjoyed the theater. He loved dancing. He liked music, and he would call all of his family together with a bell in the evening. Mark Twain makes a little fun of that. in Roughing It. If you read what Mark Twain says about all of these, he said, less than handsome women that came, by the bell. He says that Brigham deserves some medal for marrying all these women. So anyway, but it was the usual Twain. That's the same book he called the Book of Mormon chloroform and print. But that's Mark Twain. Anyway, probably never read it. I think it's the greatest book ever written, but then, different standpoint. Well, thank you for being here. Any of you have questions, or can we call it a night? Appreciate you.
I just saw the books with the Deseret alphabet.
Yeah, oh yeah, thank you.
Those are
Yeah, these are the Deseret alphabet. You probably heard Brigham started working on this for years. He had a little committee that worked on it, and they started doing newspapers in Fillmore when Deseret News was down there. I've got one of those that has Deseret alphabet in it. But he was trying to train all these people, the gathering. They were coming from Europe and from all these countries. We sent missionaries to Australia. We sent missionaries to, all over the world. It's amazing how far they went. And many of them did not speak English. So he wanted a written language, something that the kids could learn in school. And so they developed the Deseret alphabet. That stands for the Deseret First Book, is what that says. And there's an alphabet in front of each of it. The temple wasn't built yet, so it was under construction in 1868 when these came out. But as you know, it wasn't finished till 1893. But this is the first reader, and it was just like a little school reader that your kids would have, with little pictures and stuff all the way through. It's a quaint little thing. And they printed 10,000 of each of the first two. That's the Deseret second reader there. And then they decided to print the Book of Nephi in the Book of Mormon. And so they did a little. This was a year later, in 1869. The first part of the Book of Mormon came out this way. There were, I think, 8,000 of those printed. And then the real rare one was the full Book of Mormon. And only 500 of these were printed, and many of them were destroyed, lost. Some of them, frankly, I was told, got drenched in the old building on Temple Square that used to be on the southeast corner, if any of you remember the old visitor center. The basement of that, they had a lot of guns and things that got ruined too by all the moisture of City Creek that got in there. A lot of these books got destroyed. This was one of the ones that survived, but it was the full Book of Mormon. It's one of the rarest editions because they only printed 500 originally, and there are probably only 100 of them left now.
Who came up with the alphabet?
What's that?
Who came up with the alphabet?
Yeah, well, it was there were several men that worked on it at the time. I don't want to leave somebody out, but Orson Pratt was involved. He was quite brilliant. But they had George D. Watt, who was the first convert to the church from England. Unfortunately, left the church later. But I've got a sun portrait of him. You know what a sun portrait is? If any of you have been up to the Daughters of the DUP Museum in Salt Lake and seen all those portraits of pioneers, they had special paper which they could leave out with the sun in the sun with a negative, a glass negative, the sun hitting it, and it would draw an outline. You'd put it a ways away from it so you get whatever size you wanted, and then they'd have an artist come through with charcoal and paint it in. And so most of all those are called sun portraits. If you go up there and see all of those funny looking pictures of our pioneer ancestors, they're sun portraits, and so that's how they did it, When in Rome, do as the Romans do, and that was very popular in Salt Lake back in that day. Well, thank you. You've been a kind group. I appreciate your coming.